talked about David's other wives. We have looked at his sons. And today we are looking at Bathsheba. David is now king of Israel. His household has moved from Hebron to Jerusalem, a city that David has conquered and intends to make the capital of Israel. So let's look at 2 Samuel 11, beginning with verse 1 through 5. 2 Samuel 11, beginning with verse 1. And it came to pass after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. And it came to pass in an evening tide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness. And she returned unto her house. And the woman conceived and sent and told David, and said, I am with child. Now, we know that the nation of Ammon and Israel are already at war, so this is not a new war, but it is a new campaign. We're going to skip a lot of the introduction material or other background material. So with your handout, we'll be moving to page 7. And we'll be looking at there's been some controversy regarding, not controversy, but there's been some discussion about 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. That it was a time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent forth Joab and his servants, but David tarried still in Jerusalem. There are two trains of thought on this verse. One is that it was a time to fight, and kings led their soldiers into battle and to fight. However, David tarried in Jerusalem, and and I made a comment there that today sometimes when we think of the word tarry, we think of somebody deliberately delaying. It sort of sometimes has a negative connotation, that somebody is delaying doing something that they're supposed to be doing. Instead of just, they did not leave yet, they waited. Sometimes in our modern day, when we think of certain words, they may have a more negative connotation than is intended. Feeling that somebody intentionally delayed or dallied instead of doing what they should have been doing all along. So they see this sentence as a rebuke to David's behavior. And in fact, some may even have seen this as an indicator that David was already had some type of issue or was weakening before his involvement of Bathsheba. The other train of thought is that all the intent is that the writer was letting us know that it had got to that time frame in the year when the weather had reached a point when armies started moving again, campaigns started moving. And at that point in time, oftentimes it was the kings didn't have seconds in command. They ruled, they led the army depending on the size of the nation. Because we have to remember that there were times when you had kings that some of these were small, could be small city states, and sometimes, oh, replacement. I hope I have enough. I think I burnt enough trees. But they have so in other cases, kings ruled such great nations that they couldn't afford to be away for an extended period. So I think, so the idea is that the passage is merely stating the time of year, and that but David stayed in Jerusalem, and no rebuke was intended. I tend to believe that was the intent, that there was not any rebuke intended. Now, I think there'd be common agreement that if David had gone with the army and been someplace else, then obviously he could have been in a position to have seen what he saw or do what he did. But by the same token, you can say the same thing is when David woke up, what if he hadn't gone out on his roof? Or if he'd gone out on his roof, what if he had turned in, say, the other direction and looked at what was going on out that way? So, so there are a number of reasons why I think that, two, that there was no rebuke intended. There were other times when the army of Israel went out. In fact, the previous campaign against Ammon, David sent Joab, and they went out on that campaign. David didn't go with them. So there was that. We have those examples. But I think the intent had always been that at some point in time, David was going to join the army. The only question is when and under what circumstances. Otherwise, until those events transpired, David would stay in Jerusalem. And I think that's what the passage is trying to convey. And I'm down now on page 7, down where towards the bottom page where I'm talking about the Ammonites. That was probably, you get the things you want to write in, you forget to put out the most obvious. By the way, David had intended to go. I believe that passage, otherwise they wouldn't have said David tarried. It would have just said, like it did previously, David sent Joab, if he had no intention of going. But they understood that the Ammonites had already demonstrated what they were going to do, how they were going to fight the war. In the previous campaign, they had come out of their city, but as soon as the Syrians, the soldiers they had hired, fled, they pulled back into their city. So it was understood that Ammon was not going to come out and meet the army of Israel on an open field. They were going to stay in their city. That was going to be siege warfare. And siege warfare is a drawn, long-out affair. It's, very slow going, tedious, and you have no idea of knowing exactly how long it's going to take. For example, when we look at the time past here, what events occurred while Joab and the army of Israel was still in front of Rabbah. David sees Bathsheba. Bathsheba becomes pregnant. Baby is born. Baby dies. David comforts her. Bathsheba becomes pregnant. She with second child. And Solomon is born. And David is still in Jerusalem. So you're talking about a period of a year and a half to 2 years at least. You know, because it refers to it doesn't say, oh, and the baby got sick. It refers to the child as a child, which may indicate some time had passed. Don't know. Speculation. But we know that a considerable period of time had occurred and the city still had not fallen. So David and Joab, the two great military leaders of Israel, being gone out of Jerusalem for an extended period of time, on one side of the kingdom, could have invited Israel's enemies in other areas to have attacked Israel as well. And also, if we look at whatever translation you're using, if you look at the similarities between 2 Samuel 11, verse 1, and 1 Chronicles 20, verse 1, look to see what similarities. And I put down on the paper how they appear in the King James Version. And as you look at those two verses, you see the similarities of how those two verses read. But in the 2 Samuel version, it's followed immediately by the events concerning Bathsheba. In Chronicles, their focus is about the battle that occurred against the Ammonites, where there's no discussion that a rebuke was intended. Turning to page 8, the account given in 2 Samuel 11, 1 through 5 does not tell us how much time had passed between the time that Joab and the army had departed Jerusalem and David's walk on the roof. We don't know how much time passed between those two events. But we see in 11:2, most translations indicate the time as being evening time, or evening. But the evening time would have been around the time, think of it as the time as the sun is setting and going down. You're reaching the cooler part of the day, but it's before full dark. You're talking about that period where the sun is setting to the time of full darkness. Some translations even favor calling it late afternoon, as if David was waking up from an afternoon nap, even or taking a siesta. Whether that was a habit of David, don't know. But he wakes up and we see that he walks out onto his roof. He looks around and he sees a woman washing or bathing. And the scripture tells us she was very beautiful to look upon. Now, given the bathing habits of the time and area, it's unlikely that Bathsheba was naked or on public display. We don't know, we're not given her location, whether she was in was washing in the walled courtyard, or whether she was in some room and there was a window where David was able to see through and see her. And there's nothing in this passage that would suggest that it was anything other than pure coincidence that these events occurred, that David got out, walked on the roof, walked around, saw Bathsheba. I don't see anything that would suggest that it was anything more than just a coincidence. And I think that is, again, I have to speak for myself. I think that perhaps other people other than myself have experienced a time or an event where we saw something that we really wasn't supposed to see or needed to see. You know, from another person. Sometimes you go on a website, you do a search, and sometimes you open a website and that wasn't the website you needed to go to. It had an entirely different point of view. But, you know, or inadvertently sees somebody. So, and what we usually, you know, and I know, so what we usually tell our children, try to practice is, if that happens, avert your eyes, turn away, look away. And David may have done exactly that as soon as he saw Bathsheba. After all, how long does it take for a person to look at another person and think to themselves, that is a really beautiful person. Oh, that is a very handsome man. I mean, how long does that take to come to that conclusion? Not very long. At least in my experience. Oh, that's a handsome guy. Oh, that's a beautiful woman. So there, you know, again, all we're told is that he saw her. He may have immediately averted his eyes, looked elsewhere, said to himself, okay, let's go see what's happening on the other side of the patio or the roof. Or he may have continued to look at her for a while. We're just not told. One way or the other would be purely speculation. This passage does not reveal David's immediate actions on the roof. But one other thing that we should be teaching our children and practicing is if we see something that we are not supposed to see, that we need to put that out of our mind. I mean, I think one of the great inventions now with computers is the undo button. I'm very thankful for the undo button. Particularly when I accidentally delete paragraphs that I didn't mean to, or say, no, click, undo, undo. But we don't come with an undo button. You know, it's like once you see it, it's there. But where do we file that and put that in our mind? You know. And if you find yourself recalling that image, immediately replace it with another image, another thought. You know, oh, no, don't go there. Wrong. Change subject. Change topic. Think about something else. Maybe even replace it with a godly thought. We do not know how much time elapsed between the events of verse 2, when David sees Bathsheba, and the events in verses 3 through 5. We don't know if David acted immediately, spontaneously, rashly, whatever, where he immediately goes down and says, starts inquiring, who is this? Or whether it occurred over a passage of several days. That it just lingered with it. We're not told, not revealed to us. But I really don't think that is what our focus should be on. Because what we see here is the steps that David took from the time he saw her until she was pregnant. We see those steps. And I think those are the things we are to recognize and focus on, because those are points where he made a decision and took an action. And that, I think, is where we need to focus. As I mentioned, we don't know how long David looked upon Bathsheba. Maybe he immediately diverted his eyes. Maybe he continued to look at her. We hope that he immediately diverted his eyes and walked on, did something else. However, the passage indicates that David didn't put that image away and not think about it, and put his thoughts of this unknown woman from his mind. When impure thoughts occur to us, do we have an alarm that goes, impure thought, change thought, think a godly thought? I mean, some sort of like mechanism that caution, warning, go someplace else, think something else. In verse 3, David inquires about this unknown woman. Now, the fact that David was able to look from his rooftop and see any woman, again, he looked and he saw, he sees a woman. Didn't see a child, didn't see a maiden, he saw a woman. That should have told him immediately that she was either the wife or the daughter of somebody who was in his service. I mean, this is his palace area. He has other people from his government and living nearby where he can see. And we kind of, okay, these are people who are serving you. You probably shouldn't be thinking about their wife or their daughter. They probably wouldn't appreciate that. But also, by asking and inquiring about her, would suggest that David understood this wasn't just some servant girl, some nameless servant girl that might work for some family. This would be somebody that was known. So here's David. He sees a woman he hasn't ever seen before. And it's unlikely he'll ever meet her again unless he does something. So why would you want to know who it is?
Probably that he's hoping she's single and he can marry her.
From his description of her, it is believed she is Bathsheba. She is the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Okay. In 2 Samuel 23, we have a listing of the mighty men of David, the warriors, the men who have come to serve David. And they served David faithfully. And both of these men are listed as mighty warriors or mighty men for David. We already know Uriah is with the army, away, fighting a war for Israel. Perhaps Bathsheba's father is also with the army and fighting at that siege. So, you have this question of loyalty to men who are serving in your army, but David also now knows she's a married woman. And the law of Moses is pretty clear about relationships with married women. There's not room for a lot of debate. And I list the passages there. So again, you've asked, now you know. Okay. Let it go, David. But in verse 4, David sent messengers to bring Bathsheba to him. She comes, and David has sexual relations with her. Now, over the years, I personally have found the King James translation somewhat troubling in this verse. Because the King James Version uses phrases, took her, she came in unto him, and he lay with her. Those are phrases that the King James has used in reference to physical relationships between men and women. So it can be, when you see those, it's kind of, okay, what are we really being told here? And the choppiness of the verse is a little. David sent messengers and took her. Well, did David take her, or did the messengers take her? And she came in unto him, and he lay with her. You know, it's like, he sent messengers and took her. She came to him. He lay with her. And it sometimes reminds me of, and I really hate bringing this up, but I've already gone this far. Really kind of reminds me of some of the early dialogue and some of the old Tarzan movies, you know, when Tarzan is just learning English. Tarzan, Jane. Tarzan, love, Jane. You know, I mean, I'm sorry, it's just what comes to mind, but what I think the intent is that David sent messengers to bring Bathsheba to him, and she comes. Now, David may have told himself, or he may have convinced himself that, okay, I just want to meet this woman. I just want to meet her. That I don't have any other intent. But again, that raises the question, why? What possible good is going to come from this meeting? It's not like David was planning on having some sort of gathering for all the wives and daughters of the mighty men who was off in the campaign. He was just going to meet her. We do not know what reason or if he even gave a reason to the messengers he sent. You know, it's not like kings are used to giving explanations of why they're giving orders. Sometimes bosses aren't used to giving explanations of why they're telling you to do something. You know. And it's not likely that Bathsheba would even question why David would want to see her. After all, David is God's anointed king. And he has all these years served God faithfully. Why would you question why David would want to see you? So we see the very beautiful Bathsheba meets the king. Even at this point, David could have sat there and walked away. He could have sat there and said, "It's nice meeting you. I know your father and I know your husband, and you're part of the court. It is great seeing you. Just want to wish you well. Have a good day." Sent the messengers. But no, that didn't happen. At any of these points, from the time he sees her, to the time he asks about her, to the time he sends messengers, to the time she comes, at any of those times, David could have stopped himself. Perhaps he even paused and asked himself at times, "David, what are you doing, son? What are you thinking?" He could have even said, "This is wrong. You know it's wrong." Have we ever had conversations with ourselves like that? Maybe he had those conversations, but it didn't stop him. In this case, it didn't stop him from sinning. Now, again, in some previous lessons I've heard over the years that go back quite a while, I've heard people ask, "Well, why didn't Bathsheba do more?" What, you know. And again, as I mentioned here, I've heard that more years ago than I've heard it recently. But I've always felt like it was an attempt to kind of take some of the blame off of David and shift it on to her. You know, and if I go back and think of the attitudes at the time, that was sometimes the attitude that was held by society. "Oh, well, the woman was this, or the woman was that." And you know, like men didn't have a spine or a mind, you know, it's like they become zombies or something and become powerless. If we look at this account, the sum total of what we know about Bathsheba's actions: she bathed. When she was summoned by messengers, she went to David. And when David was finished, she returned to her house. That's the three actions we're told she took. We also need to remember, this account is about King David. This is about what David did and the repercussions for David and Israel. It's like everything else in God's Word. What is revealed to us is for what He wants us to reveal. This does not give us a complete history of everything that occurred. We aren't told, "Oh, well, the messengers were told this. They thought this. Bathsheba was told this. This is what she thought." we don't get all. Can you imagine how big this Bible would be if we had all of that information? And how useless that information would be? David is king. And it's really, I think it's really difficult for Americans in our society today, a nation of where we consider ourselves peers. We consider that we are all equal. You know, hey, even the president, I'm just as good as the president. I have the same rights and privileges as the president of the United States. You know, we're not accustomed to living in a society where those rights don't exist. It is hard for us to grasp the power of a Lord and Master over a subject or a servant. Recall in 1 Samuel 8, when Israel came to Samuel and said, we want a king. And the Lord told them, you consider what a king is going to do to you. That the king is going to take the best land. He's going to take the best of everything. He's going to take your best fields. He's going to take your best orchards, your best vineyards. He's going to take your children, your sons and your daughters, and he's going to put them to work doing the things that suits him. Because he's going to have that power. And they're not persuaded. They still want a king to be like every other nation. And because of that, it gave Israel the same problems as every other nation. We recall as King Saul attempted on more than one occasion to kill David. He did it in his palace, in his throne room. And none of the servants went, we got to stop this guy. None of the officials, none of the officers came and I said, sorry, King Saul, you just attempted murder. You're under arrest. You know. And later, even Queen Bathsheba would lose her position as queen when she refused to obey a command from the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. He gave her a command to come and show her beauty. It didn't matter that that command degraded his wife, and it didn't make any difference that he was somewhat intoxicated when he gave that command that she refused. He, as king, had given her a command, and she had disobeyed the king. She had to be punished. It cost her being the queen. And it made room for Esther to become queen. You know, it's just hard, I think, sometimes for us to contemplate somebody having that kind of power. Of just being able to stand up and say, you do this. And you have to do it without any thought or consideration. We're told he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness. You would think, boy, it really sounds strange that you would bring up something like that she had purified herself. because this is in reference that Bathsheba had purified herself after her menstrual period. And I wrote passages in Leviticus, that reference that. The meaning is exactly that she had completed the purification after her period. Some have speculated that perhaps David had even witnessed the last of her purification ritual. Again, that's speculation, but just so you're aware, that's some thought to that. So to a casual reader, as we're reading about this episode of David wanting this woman and then have it end with that reference, may seem strange to us. But there's a purpose. There's a purpose for everything in the Word of God. Sometimes you have to just find what that purpose is. And that purpose is this. It's a clear indication that Bathsheba was not pregnant. She had just had her menstrual period. She was not pregnant. We don't know how long that Uriah had been away from her. But this says there's no possibility at this time that she was pregnant with a child by Uriah. There's no question who's that baby, who is the father of the baby that she has, that she will have, She returns to her house. A simple statement. By chance, David sees a beautiful woman. How long he looked at her, we're not told. How long it was from the time he saw her, it's not revealed. Yet David sees her, he takes her, and then she goes home. And there's no indication whatsoever that David had any communication with her after that. In verse 5, Bathsheba sends message to David informing him that she's pregnant. In 2 Samuel 11, we see David's dropping down. We see David's attempt to cover up his guilt, calling Uriah back to Jerusalem, hoping that he will have relations with Bathsheba. And then failing that, he arranges to have Uriah killed. And I made a note there when you look at that passage in verses 17 and 24, that because it's in battle, it's just not Uriah who is killed. Other men die in battle other than Uriah. So David is responsible for their deaths as well. And then in 11:26, we see that after Bathsheba has completed her time of mourning, that David marries her. So again, there's no indication at this time that Bathsheba has any knowledge of how Uriah died. And we're left to just, in our mind, imagine what it was like for her, knowing she was pregnant, thinking about what it was going to be like when her husband returned from, war. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. We can't hide anything from God. David was as aware of that as we are today. But like us, it's interesting the lengths we will go to in an attempt to cover up or hide our transgressions from people, knowing full well we can't hide them from God. But how many times we fear the condemnation or judgment of people? And sometimes it seems like almost more than the judgment of God. In 2 Samuel 12, Nathan exposes, rebukes, and pronounces God's judgment for David's transgression. As foretold, the child to Bathsheba dies. Most translations still refers to, they don't even say Bathsheba, they just say Uriah's wife or Uriah's widow. The child that Uriah's wife or Uriah's widow bore to David. While David comforted Bathsheba over the loss of the child, she becomes pregnant again and gives birth to Solomon. We should note that God named Solomon, and I'll give you the passage for that. Bathsheba would have 4 sons by David. She is the only woman who bore more than 1 son to David. David named Solomon his successor, who was chosen by God. And then we know that as David grew old, that Ananias tries to set himself up as king. Nathan finds out about it. He tells Bathsheba. Bathsheba goes and tells David. Nathan joins to confirm what is happening. David gives instructions immediately that Solomon needs to be anointed king. Solomon is anointed king. And they rejoice. Ananias finds out at a celebration that he's holding for himself over his becoming king, to learn that he isn't king, Solomon is king. Solomon allows him to go home, but tells him if there's any wickedness in his heart, he will die. In Acts 2, how about 1 Kings 2? Ananias goes to Bathsheba, asking for a petition, asking her to go to Solomon for a petition. He tells his petition is he wants Abishag for his wife. Abishag was the virgin chosen to tend David when David got too old and no longer had body heat to keep warm. She took care of him and stayed with him. Bathsheba doesn't recognize that Ananias still thinks of himself as an exalted position. He tells her, you know the kingdom would have been mine except God gave it to Solomon. The kingdom was never his, and he didn't understand that. And because he didn't understand that, he died. And that's the last we know about any reference we have to Bathsheba. We went a little over, but we'll stop there, take a quick break. For visitors, our restroom is back